key researchers all over the world who are actively doing the cognitive theory research. And so the 2017 is a very important year for cognitive theory because the Dylan William he tweeted one very important conclusion about the theory. So he mentioned it, the it is the most important thing for teachers to know cognitive theory. So after this Twitter, in the UK, we can find a lot of government documents and government publications regarding this theory. So, for example, you can find the Ofsted, they publish some working papers or the publications about the theory, and also you can find some papers from the test magazine, and also the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, they conducted a review on cognitive science principles in the classrooms. And there is some particular sections mentioning how we are going to manage learners' cognitive load. So you can see there are a lot of um, government papers or works focusing on this theory. And now we are luckily enough, we have two researchers in the UK. So one is me, and in Loughborough University. Another one is Chris. He joins University of Birmingham July last year. So my background is more theoretical based, and Chris, he's more applied cognitive theory to take knowledge and also to measure working memory capacity. So I think two of us quite complement each other. So now in the UK we have two researchers now, and of course this is good news. And finally, I want to acknowledge the Leverhulme Trust. They offered us the funding to invite Slava to be here and also to conduct research. So this is the starter for me. I'm going to give the time to Slava. This is the main course today. Um,
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. Nice to meet you all. Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to share my screen. Sorry about that.
Okay, so there's a camera. It's good now, right? I'm visible. I usually you used to go around a little bit, so hopefully they will be okay. All right. I'm happy to be here and again thanks for to the Leverhulme Trust for this funding, and it's good to be in UK. I start just introducing very shortly myself as Slava Kalyuga. If you're wondering what a strange name, it's I was Ukrainian born. Surprise, surprise. Right now it's the news. But I was born in Western Ukraine. I finished high school there, but then I moved out. Also, I graduated in theoretical physics actually, and then I left still Soviet Union, so quite some time ago. So I've been Australian citizens for almost 30 years, and most of the time I worked in this area, which is called the cognitive load theory. So my accent also explained by that sort of Ukrainian sort of origin, still unextinguishable, unfortunately, for more than 30 years. So when I 5 lectures for the first visit, 5 lectures for the second visit, is 10 lectures generally. And when I was planning what I'm going to talk about in those lectures, there was some kind of dilemma. On one side, it's quite a lot, 10 lectures of that sort of say, or almost whatever, 90 minutes or up to 2 hours with questions as was supposed to be. I'm normally doing some university lectures of that length. For undergraduate students, I've been doing for undergraduate students, for master students, and the first thought was, or maybe I just do something like that here. But on the other side, I was thinking that should be something more distinctive, more original, and something, of course, something that incorporates some research, more sort of comprehensive research data. Some insight for that I can probably offer due to that 30 years in this area. So eventually it's come out like some kind of hybrid. On one side, it will be some introductory materials, because I assume that not everybody well familiar with this area. Also would be some kind of theoretical materials is more relevant for researchers. Could be some theoretical pure speculations that I just come out, and due to reflections on the theory for those almost 30 years. So also it would be, as you can see from the title, it's not the cognitive load theory is not in the title. It's a little bit could be broader than just cognitive load theory. We're talking about the instructional consequences of human cognitive architecture in general. But why human cognitive architecture, I will just mention it shortly when I can. So today is the first lecture in this series. So the whole series, of course, to make some completeness, it's advisable, of course, to follow all this, at least just in this period, my first visit 5 lectures, because they are interconnected, and to some degree the following lectures would be based on the previous materials. I would be from time to time returning back to some of those ideas that were described in the previous. So generally structure of the lecture is like spiral, I would go in deeper and deeper, and more examples, more specificity, but still returning to some important principles that would be noted first on more abstract level. So some combination of abstract material, theoretical speculation with some empirical materials and some specific empirical examples and so on. So today we're going to talk about the introduction to human cognitive architecture generally. So what I plan to do in this first lecture is first give us some very brief overview of that sort of development of theory for more than 30 years, just to indicate where I came into the theory, at which point, and how it's been developed since then. Then I review some main types of memory in human cognition, because those are a major component of human cognitive architecture. Some general overview first, that as a one approach to description of human cognitive architecture from point of view of memory structure. There is another approach, which is the so-called evolutionary perspective, more abstract approach. Again, I give you some overview of that also today. And I finish with some overview of the following lectures, the whole series, and the next lecture as well, just briefly. So that's kind of for today, the plan for today. So cognitive load theory in general, it could be could be defined as a sum of field of research within instructional psychology or educational cognitive psychology. We generally broadly investigate instructional implication of human cognitive architecture. What is a human cognitive architecture in this case would be defined as some kind of model of information processing. What kind of model, what current model we have, and what the implications of this model, instructional implications, implications for instructional design, for learning and instruction, and so on. So therefore, the human cognitive architecture in this case is central to cognitive load theory because it kind of defines this background, the foundation, which is which underlies all this theory. Cognitive load theory initially was developed starting from the mid-1980s by John Sweller. The initial phase, I call it clear and simple. Of course, it's in retrospectively clear and simple, maybe not that simple was initially, but the simple is from point of view that initially the general idea behind the cognitive load theory was very, very simple. We know, most of us know that we have very limited information processing capacities. We have limited working memory. If you know what is working memory is, if someone that doesn't know what working memory is, probably he or she knows what short-term memory is. It's just similar. We will talk about difference between those concepts later, maybe in the next lecture in more details. But people talk about short-term memory, they know roughly what it is. If you don't know what a short-term memory is, you probably have good understanding that we have a limited attentional capacity. Everybody knows that we cannot pay attention to many things at the same time. And all those three things, working memory, short-term memory, and attention, actually is very closely related. Because what is in working memory or short-term memory is actually what is in the focus of attention. So at least you know one of those things. Limited working memory, we have limited working memory, we have limited short-term memory. Maybe some of you know the 7 plus minus 2, George Miller's short-term memory span. That's we cannot process simultaneously more than those 7 plus minus 2, if only storage involved. Or you can have general idea about that our attentional resources are limited, and therefore we are limited in information processing capacity. Therefore, from instructional point of view, the good idea would be just to try to reduce those the need for information processing when we design instructional materials or learning tasks, when we select learning tasks. We need to design them, we need to select them in a way that learners do not require overwhelming or excessive amount of cognitive resources, whatever it is, working memory capacity or short-term memory or attentional resources. So the idea is very simple, just reduce demands on cognitive resources. And that idea was initially sort of, that's why it was clear and simple. And that generated at that stage quite a number of instructional technique, or as they call cognitive load effects in cognitive load theory, where split attention effect, redundancy effect, and so on. We will talk about them in the following lectures. So that was initial phase, and that pretty much in the mid-1990s when I started working in this area as well. It was at that stage. So the next stage was when more factors actually come into theory and more types of load, because it became clear, pretty obvious, that the load could be not only kind of cognitive load, some negative things. Without cognitive load, we cannot learn anything. So cognitive load is not only negative, but also positive. If you're not experiencing any cognitive load, it means that you probably not learn anything at all. You learn nothing, because you're not processing anything, you're not experiencing any load. So there is a negative, there is a positive load. So there is a kind of load that we need to get rid of, and on the other side there is a load that we need to encourage and take it. So already two types of cognitive load. So at that stage, so they were called intrinsic, which is a useful load, and extraneous, which is a not relevant to learning, something that need to be get rid of. So theory started essentially from extraneous load, and then introduced this intrinsic like something useful. Also, more factors started being, one important factor that started to be considering is a learner prior knowledge. And actually, when I started doing research in this area, that was my sort of first things, effect of or role of learner prior knowledge in cognitive load theory. So I managed essentially to do all my research career actually mostly investigating this sort of factor. It's generated this so-called expertise reversal effect and so on. So that point where I entered this sort of research with a prior knowledge or expertise, as is sometimes called, in cognitive load theory. Then later, like starting from 2000, so John Swallow introduced this so-called evolutionary perspective. It's a completely different view on cognitive load theory, which is based not on those empirical research into memory, which is a pretty much experimental psychology sort of foundation, which cognitive load is, but some kind of different perspective based on some general principle, considering human cognitive architecture as a form of natural information processing system in general. And we're going to talk about this today in much more detail, so I'm not detailing sort of more at this point. But that was kind of again important milestone in development of theory, because since then many papers, especially which include John Swallow as a co-author, actually they list those evolutionary principles usually from the beginning, and therefore if you want to understand this theory and to be able to read those papers, and many of them you will see those evolutionary evolutionary principles of developing human cognitive architecture. So we need to talk about them. That another whole perspective. So the latest, the theories expanded in a lot of different, sometimes very unexpected areas. In many, to significant degree, due to those additional sort of evolutionary perspective. Just for example, something like role of human movements, a role of pointing when, for example, children learn and they point, or not necessarily children, sometimes pointing on some stuff when you, or tracing when you learn something. Or, it's on a first glance, it does no relations to cognitive process with cognitive, specifically working memory processes or those cognitive load processes. But due to this relation to evolutionary perspective, it's appear to have some kind of relation. Therefore, collaborative learning also was investigated in this, and this time is again have some kind of evolutionary aspect into this from cognitive load perspective, and so on. So started that expansion into different areas, unexpected areas. Essentially, it continues up until now. But I listed just last one, this kind of back to simplicity and establishing boundaries. And again, because that's something that there is some tendency, and I'm actually was involved in to some degree that is generated that tendency as well. So instead of those type of cognitive load, when I mentioned intrinsic and extraneous, later was some germane load introduced, and so on. So now again we're going back to simplicity, trying to define some intrinsic and extraneous type of cognitive load as a basic, and put it just two rather than more. Also important thing is to understand where cognitive load theory is effective, where it's applicable, to what types of tasks, and where it may be not effective and should not be used. So to understand those kind of boundaries of applicability of the theory. That's important thing as well. I've been working on that also in recent years. So yes, from my perspective, okay, it's obviously subjective. It reflects my perspective and maybe my place in those phases of development. But from my perspective, that those phases are like this. So again, we get back to specific scene of cognitive load theory in the next lecture. But today I'm going to talk about that human cognitive architecture mostly. That's the topic of this lecture: introduction to human cognitive architecture. For the cognitive load theory, there is I already mentioned that to some degree, two major approaches to describing this architecture. So one is based on, as I call it, empirical approach grounded in experimental psychology. So those kind of different types of memories that psychology already established, that it's not a result of cognitive load theory, it's well established by other researchers in other fields, and we mentioned some of them later. But other approach is this I call it axiomatic approach. Again, it's my terms, but it's grounded in that evolutionary ideas and analogy of axiomatic, because it's actually postulate some principles of operation of human cognitive architecture. And based on those principles, that's sort of all the justifications for cognitive load theory effect is produced and so on. So we're going to talk today about these two approaches. So that's the remaining of this lecture. I will start from the empirical sort of foundation, and then second part would be about axiomatic, the kind of evolutionary perspective. Okay, from this experimental psychology and general point of view, the human cognitive architecture could be described something like in the form of these diagrams like this. So it includes some sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. These three components. Again, for cognitive load theory, most important are working memory and long-term memory. Sensory memory is coming here as a kind of this initial buffer where the information coming into, just to indicate that we don't get information directly from outside world into working memory into our mind. The information has been taken into sensory memory, some kind of buffer, it's held there for some limited amount of time, just in order to capture some of the information. Then it's transformed into those electrochemical signals and go to the brain already in that form. So we don't process, of course, some external information directly. So this buffer, the sensory memory in this case, is next. But it's not very important for cognitive load theory for some reason that we mentioned. Just to give you some illustrations what those types of memory are. So as I said, sensory memory, it's just the components that briefly, few seconds and less. For visual memory, it's half of a second, up to half of a second, 500 milliseconds generally. For auditory sensory memory, for auditory buffer, is up to 3 seconds, a little bit holding longer. But that where this initial stimuli from outside world is held for that initial perceptual processing. And if they have some familiar patterns already, we identify them. Just for example, I give you some very quick example. If I show you something like this, very quickly, fraction of a second, possibly a second, but you've seen something familiar, right? Probably most of you as some equation. You as most of you is mathematics background, you saw something. If you're not mathematics background, you probably recognize some letter X or there some numbers or whatever. But you were able to catch even in those fractions of second something familiar because you already have some patterns in your long-term memory. Then we're going to talk later about those patterns are whole. But you already have some familiar patterns. So important thing that even during that very brief exposure, we're able to catch some familiar pattern. But generally, sensory memory holds information for very brief. Now you're thinking about that equation, maybe, but that's already not sensory memory. That's already gone into your working memory, of course, because sensory memory operates on this 1 second essentially scale. Working memory, or let's see, in brackets, short-term memory, not discussing the difference at this point. Let's consider it as pretty much the same at this point. It's something like place where we meaningfully processing information already, meaningfully, consciously processing information. So sometimes it's you can think about working memory as a sort of place of consciousness, where you're thinking about subconsciously. That's what is in your working memory. So again, I'm using the same example. This equation, now if you try to solve it, you're doing this processing, you're doing it in your working memory. So you're doing some operation, you store some intermediate result possibly, and so on. When you store them in that short-term memory, because only responsible for storage, not for processing. So the short-term memory, running ahead a little bit, is a sub-component of working memory where we actually only store information, but not process. In working memory, we generally process information. So you do those manipulations, operations of solving this equation, you do it into your working memory. Maybe after that you're doing during some matter of seconds, 10 seconds, maybe 20 seconds, that scale of operation of working memory. After a minute or 2 or 5 or 10, you likely forget this equation. It's gone. Because it was, if you don't pay attention to this, not rehearse it, you lose it. So working memory is in effect is limited again. If we're going to talk about those specific limitation characteristic next lecture, but today you might maybe you remember that sort of or encounter some names like George Miller. Short-term memory span 7 plus minus 2 I mentioned already before, so we're able to actually to hold 7 plus minus 2 elements after brief exposure, like telephone number, mobile number, whatever, 10 digits. In Australia, I don't remember how many in UK, but they're pretty much already in excess of that amount. So therefore, if you hear some unfamiliar mobile numbers that you never had before, it's very difficult to remember because it possibly exceeds that 7 plus minus 2, meaning from 5 to 9. That's the span of short-term memory. George Miller, another British actually person who significantly contributed into studying these working memory characteristics and introduced actually the working memory the theory, the whole experimental studies. Alan Gaddelin, he actually the person who associated with all this research in working memory, pioneering research. Again, it's limited in capacity and limited in duration as well, matter of seconds, a few items only. We talk about those limitations next lecture, but today just that brief introduction. So that about working memory. Finally, long-term memory, the final component. Long-term memory actually is something where we store actual knowledge. It's our knowledge base. It's some indefinite storage, theoretically indefinite. Sometimes we losing some of the information if we don't use it, but essentially it's all our knowledge base that we have for the lifetime and information accumulated. So the permanent repository. Again, I'm using the same example of that equation, where those rules come from that you use to solve this equation. They are in your long-term memory. Those rules are in your long-term memory, you just activate and use them, but they are indefinite in your long-term memory. You can use them automatically will probably do that. But nevertheless, they are in long-term memory. So automatic procedures, even though those well-practiced automated procedures, still in long-term memory. Even if not automatic, if you use it explicitly, they still be activated from your long-term memory. So that kind of now knowledge base. So this very briefly characteristic of those three types of memories. Now I get back to this model of human cognitive architecture and show few different possible situations here, because not all of the types of memory always used in every kind of situation. This kind of more generalized model. So on one side, we can present something like this, slightly different modification, showing that actually there's some external stimulus coming through sensory memory and go into working memory. So we're paying attention to something, select some information from that buffer in sensory memory, and taking into working memory and starting processing, trying to make sense out of this, relying on our knowledge base. So that would be situation when essentially working memory is actively used and relied to some degree, working memory relies on long-term memory. For example, if you see this Chinese character, if you know have no knowledge in Chinese characters, you probably would wonder, you get into your working memory some of those lines and try to make some sense out of it. Recombine them and trying to make sense that resemble to some degree maybe some human beings with the legs and hands and a head, and you will try, you can do some manipulations and some speculations in your working memory. That material is coming from outside, and in working memory you trying consciously to make sense, using some knowledge from long-term memory, knowledge about those lines, about some human figures that are coming from your long-term memory, your knowledge base. But that's what you essentially would be doing. Of course, Chinese person for whom it's very well knowledge, they're not going to use that process. They're going to use a different process. They directly recognize it without working memory. In sensory memory, they apply this already available pattern. But still, talking about this working memory, if I show you this, again, this line, is something that doesn't make, again, clear sense. It's just a combination of lines. You will take it into your working memory, you'll try to do some kind of possibly manipulation of what it might resemble, maybe some of that Greek letters that use, or anything else. You can make some association in your working memory, trying to make sense, very kind of hardly in this case. But that's not it. I will recombine those lines a little bit, and it would be something like this, and you can make immediate sense right out of this, because you have that kind of pattern in your long-term memory. So so you can make sense of, you don't use working memory in this case. You immediately see something familiar that you can make sense of it, right? So you're taking it through sensory memory, you apply your pattern from knowledge base, from long-term memory, and you have some interpretation, you're tasking this, whatever your response and action. So working memory is not involved, should not necessarily involve in all cases. So in some cases we involve, in some cases we directly, the direct perception here we're talking about. Okay, we can have another situation when not external information coming in. We generate some knowledge in working memory, possibly using some already information that we hold in some knowledge that we call in long-term memory. So, for example, an artist can generate some abstract picture, something like this or whatever, just inside the room without any kind of external stimulus, just generated inside working memory and painted using possibly some painting patterns that person already have in long-term memory, some from previous experience and so on. But in this case, no stimulus, no sensory memory, no just working memory generates some action in this case. So the point of this few examples just to show that all those components, they are important components, essential. Their characteristics are essential, but they're not necessarily involved in all situations, depending on whether the knowledge is automated. Working memory might not be involved. Something that we're already well familiar with, we directly perceive. So you don't have to involve conscious processing in working memory when you're looking at this room and see some familiar object like those chairs and a clock or something. You already have some pattern for them. You immediately recognize them. You don't think about that what it is. You know, because they're kind of direct perception. So in this case, no sensory memory, no working memory, sensory memory involved, of course. No working memory. In some cases, working memory will require essentially. What is important in learning situation, when we learn new knowledge, we usually require working memory. And that's what makes learning difficult, because it's imposing actually load on working memory. And because working memory is limited, they create a difficulty. So that's why learning could be difficult, because we have to process a lot of information in working memory, and that working memory is limited in capacity. Does that make it difficult? So later we will see during those lectures how we can alleviate it, how we can make it easier, which ways, how to reduce that need to get this working memory involved, and how to reduce that working memory, how to reduce demand on working memory resources. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say here about this human cognitive architecture from this experimental psychology point of view. Okay, so that pretty much sufficient foundation for developing the theory, the cognitive load theory. Nothing else really is required. We have the important component, and we know their characteristics and how they operate in different situations. That is sufficient for developing cognitive load theory and how it was developed from the beginning. And but in around, as I mentioned before, in around 2000, it was an alternative perspective. I wouldn't say not alternative, but a different perspective was introduced, which is that so-called evolutionary perspective. Right? So now we finish with this, and we go to evolutionary. But before, I want to mention some, as I call them, counterintuitives. I don't know whether it's correct word or not, or I invented it, but what I mean is some things that come in word dictionary. It always in red underneath, like something that's not in dictionary. So I'm just wondering whether this word exists or not. But I mean it, counterintuitive things, that something that go against our normal common sense. So there is some counterintuitive things in this kind of working, in this human cognitive architecture characteristics, and some of those we already mentioned, but some of them, some of which we will look at in the following lectures. One of those is the point that actually having limited local memory capacity is something to advantage. Because the common sense will tell us if we have this limited capacity is bad, how we can operate with this limited working memory capacity. Taking a lot of information with this kind of bottleneck of limited capacity, it's something like really bad. It's a bad luck. In fact, it's not a bad luck. It's something very good for human cognition, and we'll see why later. Another something that could be with counterintuitive. Actually, we humans, we are addicted to knowledge, and I place in this addicted. It's not like figurative term. Sometimes, actually, even literally. There was some research in that neurobiochemistry that show that we generate in our mind similar those chemical substance when we actually learn something and understand with understanding. So we experience some pleasure from learning things and understanding them, acquiring some knowledge. And chemically, it's the same type of substance that are generated when we do some kind of other activities that generate pleasure, like taking some drugs or something like that, or narcotics, or whatever, alcohol, similar things. Acquiring knowledge and understanding, acquiring knowledge biochemically could be similar. So we are really addicted to knowledge, to expertise, because we are knowledge-based creatures. And again, we will see to some degree later today, with this evolutionary perspective, why it's so. So then another thing that could counterintuitive, because on the other side, we all know that knowledge is something that difficult to acquire. Sometimes many learners experience difficulty. Students and school children not always motivated and don't like and all those things. But in fact, we are addicted as a general, as in our cognitive architecture, in our structure, in our mind, we are addicted to knowledge. We cannot function without knowledge. That's the main things that allow us to function effectively, successfully. Another related issue that it's so important to us, the knowledge, that we actually, in many cases, we won already with some knowledge of some common activities embedded into us. So we can say, inborn expert in some activity. What type of activity, what kind of knowledge, we're going to talk a bit later today. So that, again, something counterintuitive, because from common sense, we all believe that all the children are born with this blank sort of mind, and then we just fill in it with all the information, they learn it, and that's very difficult to learn and so on. But in fact, many children already born with some predisposed to acquire this knowledge very rapidly without any intervention from us. So in many activities, they do that as a tribute to that kind of important role of knowledge in our human cognitive functioning. Other type of counterintuitive, now we go to instructional, more closer to instructional things that we're going to talk about later in this lecture course. From common sense, when we're talking about, for example, giving some instructional guidance to learners, for example, to novices, we can say that a lot of instructional guidance is good for novices. And we provide a lot of explanations how to do something when we teach some students. But most of us also believe that if we give that sort of information to more advanced learners, that's okay. For novices, they need it, but if you give it for advanced learners, it won't harm. They just possibly help them to some degree also and so on. In fact, the empirical data show that results show that so on. It's actually, it would harm advanced learners. So if you give detailed information, excessive guidance to more advanced learners who don't really need it, their information processing could be in this case could be harmed. Could be less effective than in a case when less information is provided. Also, whether it's good for novices, it's not always 100% clear case. In some cases, in some situation, depending on what instructional goals we're chasing, it's not guaranteed. In some cases, maybe less also could be better, but that depends on what instructional goals there are. Again, we're going to talk about that later. I just give you some, just some kind of listing those counterintuitive things, just to generate maybe something for future, what you can learn in next from those coming lectures. And then finally, we're going to talk about this probably in the second part of this lecture series, some of diagnostic assessment. We're going to use it to diagnose that knowledge that the learners have. So we use some diagnostic assessment. So we can use some traditional long tests like a series of many tasks, or you can do some multiple choice, the battery of the multiple choice test, or we can use some very rapid test, some very limited rapid tests, just for example, asking them to whether they can recognize something quickly, or whether they can produce some solution step, not a whole solution, but first step or something. There is some kind of rapid test which is much shorter. The important thing, the counterintuitive thing is that in some cases this rapid test not even less adequate and effective, but in some cases they are more adequate and more effective for diagnosing knowledge than themselves comprehensive long tests. So the less is more here, the principle, right? So some reduced tests would give us more diagnostic information than longer tests. So again, in a counterintuitive result, again, we're going to discuss this much later in this course. So it's kind of just some few these so-called counterintuitives or counterintuitives here that I wanted just to mention at this point, just to show you what we're going to discuss to some degree later in the course. So now, the final is that we go to this evolutionary perspective. That another perspective on describing human cognitive architecture. This is regarded quite complex thing by many people, many even researchers. They think that why do we need actually all this complex thing if the things are pretty much very simple? We have limited working memory capacity, just reduce the demand on this, and that's all a cognitive theory about. But here is a very different perspective that introduce some very interesting kind of a viewpoint on this, and it was introduced by Prof Slava himself. There's nobody else. That's his product. Here in our book with the 2011, which you mentioned here, very sort of long description of that of the evolutionary perspective, but one first third of that book actually devoted to this, and it's very complex on the material with all of that biological analysis and so on. But essentially, this all these perspectives is considering human cognition not as just only the human cognition only and nothing else. It considers human cognitive system as a type of the broader class of natural information processing systems. So it's definitely natural and information processing system, but human system is only one of many. There is other creatures, there is other system, the biological level, some organic matter, some other animals around, maybe some different. We will do some speculation in a few minutes. But there is a lot of natural information processing system, and they pretty much operate on the similar principles. And those 5 of such principles. So on one side, from instructional perspective, you can think, oh, what has got to do with instruction and so on? Maybe nothing really, but it could be a lot on the other side, because that shows us some characteristics of human cognitive architectures that are common for all natural information processing systems at first, and secondly, just from philosophical point of view, it's very interesting, because we see actually very broad perspective of where the human cognition belongs in a wide array of general of nature, and to a significant degree we have pretty much similar general principles that other organisms actually operate in use, and we look at those principles. So this is a very, from just curiosity point of view, it's important thing, because it shows us that sort of place of human cognition in nature. But obviously we can interpret all of those principles, and we're gonna do this during this series of lecture, based on those characteristics of human cognition that we discussed previously today, based on experimental psychology. So let's look at some of those 5 principles briefly again. First one is information store principle, which essentially says that any of that type of information processor system, whether it's human or otherwise, and John Sval and his work actually refer mostly to those others, to biological system, or first of all, biological evolution as a system is a biological system, and there is some analogy, which is, and some of the analogy I will trace as an example in this case. So any of these system includes a huge store of information, large store of information. Could be larger or less, but depending on organism, but they all operate based on some store of information patterns. And those information patterns essentially define how this system operates in external environment. So we have this because we have long-term memory. That's our knowledge base. That is the stored information part in our long-term memory. In biological system is a genome. That's the store of biological information. That's that store of necessary biological information that propagate and so on. Long-term memory, that's something that when we talk about human cognition, that there are store of that sort of information patterns. So that's important. It pretty much looks simple, but it's very important in the first principle, because all other principles actually show how that store is acquired and what characteristic of that kind of acquisition. So all other principles remaining 4 would be in effect serving this main principle. So information store. The second one is so-called borrowing and reorganizing principle. That principle actually that's showing how that knowledge in information store is acquired. There is 2 principles that describes this. First one is this borrowing and reorganizing, which is actually saying that most of that information in that information store actually coming from borrowed actually from other stores, and then actively reorganized. It's not copied, never copied, but reorganized, but then borrowed. They're not reinvented every time. So they borrowed from other, whether in case of our human cognition. So we borrow that knowledge from other sources, from other people. We can actually see how they behave and simulate similar. We can mirror some of that behavior. We can read books. We can listen to other people. That's how we essentially take the information. We not invent every piece of knowledge that we have ourselves. We just borrow from a lot of different sources, but we borrow, but we're not copying, never copying. Nothing is really copied. It's always reorganized according to what already in long-term memory. So that incoming information that we borrowed is always being processed in working memory in connection with what is already in long-term memory. It's been integrated, reorganized, and then placed as a modified part into long-term memory again as a result of that processing. So it's borrowed and reorganized, that principle. The same happens in biological system. So that genetic information in biological organism actually is borrowed due to the sexual reproduction and so on in biological system, but genome is borrowed from others. So the children borrow it from parents and so on. So that literally is borrowed, right? Or it's not reinvented every time. There could be some modifications, but would be another principle about this. But it's borrowed and reorganized. That's one source of getting new information. Another one, when there is no actually source to borrow from. There could be a situation. There is no any. So we're facing some task, some situation, but we haven't got. It's very difficult to imagine practically, but theoretically you can imagine situation. There is no knowledge relevant to the situation. In reality, we always have something in our knowledge base. Something we will later discuss where that something coming from, but we always have something. But theoretically, we can say there is nothing available, we have to reinvent something new. In this case, we approach this invention in a way that described as a kind of random processes. So we do some kind of this random test, generate and test processes. So we just come up with some solution and then see whether they would solve the situation or not. If not, we just discuss them. If they solve the situation, we adopt them. So, but this pretty much random process. Again, the degree of randomness is not something absolute, is not always completely random, because even when we generate and test, we sometimes follow in some logic. We don't just completely randomly generate things. We have some generated meaningfully, some logically, and we see some of those typical processes later. But in biological system, it's random mutations. You know, that process, that random mutation essentially lead to changes in organism. But those mutations are in many cases, in most cases, random. So by random mutations, we gradually, the organism could change over the millions of years and so on, over that period of time. With the human knowledge, long-term memory is not take over those millions of times. That's much more faster. But pretty much when we use some trial and error technique to solve the problem in unfamiliar situation, or mean sense analysis, who don't know what it is, we will look at this in more detail in one of the following lectures. But those general heuristics rather than knowledge based. So when we don't have knowledge, we use some of those heuristics. In a very simple case, we just trial in some possible solution and see whether it's produce the results or not. If it's erroneous, we discard it and try another. But when we do this trial and error, we still not completely random. Of course, we do it meaningfully, but pretty much still search-based processes. So that's how the new knowledge, according to these principles, is generated. Again, as I said, we're going to talk about some specific details and mechanism, which is exemplified this principle later in the course of this lecture. The next principle is so-called narrow limits of change principle. So when we operate in that novel environment, in a new, so the system allows all very small incremental changes to information store. Those modifications in knowledge due to those, either due to random processes or due to borrowing as well in many cases, but they are random gradual. We don't normally change the system significantly. So step by step. So in case of a biological system, mutations are always small at a time and takes millions of years due to these very small changes, small mutation to generate some new organism that's completely different from original and so on. In human knowledge, in human cognition, actually, our limited capacity of working memory, essentially, that's a mechanism that implements these gradual changes. Working memory capacity is limited, and that doesn't allow big changes to knowledge base. It's only some gradual, by step, gradual sort of the small incremental changes. Why so? Because it would be significant change. It could essentially damage the system functionality. Just imagine if it's That's what happened in cancerous cells in biological system when some changes started generating in rapidly, not small incremental for a minute, but the cells grow rapidly. Some of those cancerous cells. That example when this principle is violated in biological system and it's actually destroys the system. The similar could be in human cognition in knowledge base. If we introduce in a novel environment some significant change that could damage that sort of available knowledge base because it would introduce some significantly new components that might not be incorporated that sort of organically into that system. So it should be very small incremental changes. So working memory actually produces these small incremental changes or gives this mechanism for limiting them. So that's why one of the answers to that counterintuitive things why working memory is limited working memory is not always bad. We'll look at some other argument later, but that's kind of already something that working memory allows actually this knowledge base in long-term memory to preserve it is some complete sort of system and don't make any big sort of unexpected changes that could essentially damage that knowledge in long-term memory, meaning that the understanding would in this case suffer in case of human cognition. So that's the number 4 principle. And the last one finally is called this environmental organization linking principle, which has some complex name, but the meaning here is very simple. So when we are functioning in familiar environment, so in a situation when we already have relevant knowledge available in long-term memory, so not novel situation where the new environment, but in familiar. Familiar meaning in this case that we already have some knowledge patterns in long-term memory relevant to that specific environment. In this case, all these limitations essentially are reduced, or in some cases, actually eliminated. So we can process in this case a lot of information because we function in that familiar environment and we have some pattern that allow us to take a lot of information. Some mechanisms that in some of the following lectures we will look at specifically this kind of chunking, right? When we chunk information into some larger units and process them for those units. That's something that relates to human cognition. So again, I'm not going into details of biological system, but some epigenetic processes that describe this biological function in environment when some genes are turned off or on, and a complete sort of parts of the organism is reproduced rather than just those simple genes level. That describes this principle in biology. In human cognition, prior knowledge and long-term memory, essentially that's something that removes or reduces this working memory limitation. If we function in familiar environment, meaning that we have knowledge about that environment, we have some knowledge pattern, it would mean that we actually that those limitations of working memory could be removed. That's how we can process a lot of information because of this, because we make environment familiar. That's the main approach how we humans, that's why knowledge is important, critical, and why we are addicted to that, because we make the environment familiar when we acquire new knowledge. And that makes us capable of reducing those working memory limitations or even practically eliminating them when we function like expert in familiar environment. So again, so these principles relate to those situations. Okay. So now, it pretty much looks abstract, 5 principles, but those they describe all natural information processing system, presumably all of them. Okay, I just did some speculation, pure speculation. Would that extrapolate downward, meaning to sync the system? We're talking about like biological system here and human cognitions, so that more higher level system in evolution. But what we will go to some lower level, like to the level of some unorganic matter, something that matter that physics actually dealing with. Would that be still stands or not? Would they be called natural information processing system? They are natural, of course. Would they information processing system? That depends what you regard as information. So if you define information as a generally some attribute or object of any nature that actually characterized by some stable organizational pattern, that's one of the possible definition. I like this definition, and that's one of the definition of information. What is information? It's availability of some organizational pattern. So an object of any nature could have information if this is not chaotic matter, but somewhat organized matter. So if we adopt this definition of information, in this case, could we apply to some lower level some system? For example, let's have some atomic system, like in physics or study atoms. Would they are natural? Are they information processing system? Are they do they actually have this some information kind of characteristics? Possibly, because they store some structural pattern of their organizations or atoms. They have this those specific pattern of atomic level or electron levels, atoms of specific elements, whereas hydrogen or oxygen have very well defined and specific those electronic levels, atomic levels, right? So that could be regarded as this kind of very kind of structural pattern that they possess. Every atom of that specific element would have the same pattern of organization in this case. So they presumably have this. And in this case, we can say that they somehow store this pattern. So they have this information stored somewhere. Secondly, they might have emerged on some earlier stages from some random interaction between particles during some that kind of big bang, when the matter was generated and everything seems to be chaotic. But later stages, in a few seconds, so after that explosion, things become kind of interacted, and some more higher level structure become to be formed. And some of those, like hydrogen atoms, were generated possibly from the random interactions of those subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and so on. So again, we have some kind of analogy here of this randomness principle of generation, right? So it's random interactions generated. So we have some analogy, similarity of kind of another principle enacted here. And then finally, this information patterns actually guides these interactions of those atoms. So these electronic atomic levels essentially define how those atoms interact with each other. So in this case, they in that environment. So in this case, they pretty much serve this last principles of environmental linkage and kind of principle where we have some specific already knowledge in there, some patterns already available, and they define interaction with the environment. So it's a pure speculation, nothing else. That I then do some mental exercise, then an example of atom. But it looks like some of those principles, not all of them, in this case 3, looks pretty much something that would make sense. So when we go from this atomic level to the more complex matter, like more say organic systems, more complex systems, so some additional principles could evolve. So that narrow limits of change could evolve to prevent this complex system from being damaged by big random changes. Okay, at some stage, this mechanism for borrowing and reorganizing could again evolve to result in some self-reproduction. Borrowing, in this case, we're talking about like this borrowing in biological system, self-reproduction in biological system. So this this could emerge in some case, in some stage of evolution. So generally, we can say in this case that all five principles applies to generally more complex organic biological systems, but some principle could be applied already to very rudimentary, those very lower level systems and early stages of, in this case, we can not in biological evolution, but generally cosmic evolution. So generally, it makes sense. Again, it's no way any proofs or any justification, strict one, but just speculation. They're showing that that makes sense. Something that appear initially, then evolved and emerged on a higher levels. And currently, when we're talking about biological system or human cognition, we're talking about all these five principles, and then pretty much describe this system. So, what important consequences of this already perspective, evolution perspective, that these five principles that we described, one important thing is that we can take on board that the critical role of that information store. It's always there. Whatever it changes, all other principles describe how that is generated, how it's changed, and so on, but we're always talking about the information store. That's something that allow our successful adaptation to the environment, but making it familiar. So if we acquire more patterns, information patterns, or knowledge in human cognition into that long-term memory store, information store in general case, we are more able to function more successfully in environment because we make that environment familiar. That our main sort of principle how the human cognitions actually functions, as well as other natural information processing system. We are successfully function environment because we make it familiar. We acquire knowledge. We make environment familiar. And that's what makes us able to function successfully in that environment. In case of human cognition, it literally means that we acquire knowledge, and that makes that environment to which that knowledge is relates familiar to us. We become expert in that sort of specific type of task. So that means that fundamentally we are knowledge-based creatures. That's the most important thing that actually guides our function in any environment and do any task. We are experts because we make this environment of our expertise familiar, and we acquire this kind of a lot of knowledge. That's the only way, and that's the most important way. Okay, so, but talking about this human cognition and natural information processing system as in nature, is there any difference between human cognition and other information? We say that those five are pretty much the same principle for humans and for other, at least biological systems. Whether it's animals or some other biological systems, plants and so on, it looks like they all operate under the same type of principle. So what? Are we still at the same level? Are we different? What is the difference, if any? I'm not saying that there should be necessarily a difference at all. Like I'm not saying that the religious point of view that God created human to be supreme. I adopt the view that the humans evolved during the millions of years from lower level organisms. But are we really different, or we're nothing different is the same? So if a different, what the difference is? Just to, let's speculate a little bit about this. There is some things that can give us some idea of this. It is called difference between biologically primary and secondary information. That some concepts that were developed in evolutionary educational psychology, significant contribution by David Geary, but to define those type of knowledge. But that gives us some kind of a insight here. If we're different, then by what? So in this point of view, two types of knowledge are distinguished: the biologically primary and biologically secondary. Let's talk about primary. The biological primary knowledge, that is some type of intuitive type of knowledge that we evolved to acquire rapidly, implicitly, without any explicit instruction, just by being involved into corresponding environment. That's how small children acquire many knowledge of how to deal with many type of situations. That's something that I mentioned before in those counterintuitive, that we are inborn expert in some field because we are biologically predisposed to acquire it rapidly. That means that we're inborn expert actually in those fields already. Examples, some listening and speaking some basic native language. Speaking and listening, not writing or reading. Speaking and listening. We learn this in a very early childhood, no instruction given, we just been involved into some environment like talking, speaking parents or group of other children and so on, and we rapidly learn this in a matter of the first few years of life. We acquire that without any explicit kind of instruction on anything. So just functioning environment give us that, guarantees this. Some basic intuition about physical environment. We have intuition that the world is flat, pretty much. We see the horizon with no roundness. That's one of the intuition. Some other physical intuition that you can come up with that we are just acquired because we function in this environment. They could be, from point of view of physics education, they're not always good because we need to overcome them. But generally, those are basic intuitions that we function about. And the flatness of Earth is one of those pretty well kind of known one. We live in flat world, no, not on a globe. And that's one of those intuitions. Basic social interaction skill. Nobody teaches students how to interact with other children just from the scratch. They acquire those basic interaction skills in this implicit way. They're already predisposed to acquire this rapidly. They are, you can say, in a way, they become kind of small experts in some basic interactions without any instruction. So this is type of this biological primary knowledge. So, for example, here's an example of this misconception about the roundness of Earth. But this is essentially our intuition that we, primary knowledge, we live in a flat world. But when later we starting learning in a school that the Earth actually is round, that kind of globe, that was eventually that kind of knowledge that would be generated. That the children try to, in this case, to integrate these intuitions, primary intuition, with some of that instructional knowledge. That was they come up in some cases. Again, from point of view of physics education, is something that misconception need to be overcome. But that nature of our cognition, and this is something that we acquire in this rapid way. So this biological knowledge essentially is such as we acquire it rapidly in implicit way because it was important for survival during evolution, biological evolution. You need to have these intuitions to survive in that environment. We need some basic social interaction skills. We have some basic communication skills to survive over the millions of years. Therefore, those type of knowledge evolve to be of that sort of kind, to be able we are able to acquire that rapidly without much of explicit instruction. So from this perspective, that also explains this sort of how that important in general from that information store, that our drive for acquire extensive store of information in our long-term memory to function successfully in environment actually caused that we, during the evolution, we evolved to be able to acquire this primary knowledge in this rapid, implicit way without any kind of working memory or conscious processing really involved. So we acquire most of that knowledge in this rapid, implicit way. And in this way, we already accumulate a lot of knowledge in this information store in long-term memory in early years of life, in that implicit rapid way. So now, biological secondary knowledge. That kind of knowledge that evolved on a later stages of evolution, where we starting making this primary knowledge explicit and trying to modify it to solve some new type of task that the human, in this case, come up with an encounter with. So we come with the culture-specific knowledge, which was appear on the later stages of evolution. For example, written language, so reading, writing, science. That's something that exists for only a few thousand years, or maximum 5,000-6,000. It's not a millions of years of evolution. Something relatively in evolutionary perspective. We're not biologically evolved to acquire this knowledge in that sort of rapid, implicit way. So we have to acquire it hard way through conscious processing into working memory. But how that knowledge generally initially appeared is not out from nothing. It's not out of a significant degree of random generation. That knowledge essentially acquired initially from biologically primary knowledge. By making it explicit, thinking consciously about this, we come up with biological secondary. Just to give some example how that appeared to come in case of base 10 number system in mathematics and arithmetics. What would be biologically primary knowledge in this case? Some knowledge of some small numbers. That's something that children could be able. Some small 1, 2, 3, some of those small numbers, they might not even know words, but they understand the concept. 1 object, 2 object, 3 object, not too many, but small numbers. Magnitude, in this case, they are able to understand what more or less, the more object or less number of objects. So magnitude is another kind of primary ability, understanding basic magnitude, comparing the quantities in case of small quantities. Next one, some successive counts increase quantity by 1. So 2 is, you add 1, you got 2. You got another 1, you got 3, and so on. In case of small numbers, these successive counts. So those, again, this type of primary abilities. So we have those 3 underlying primary abilities, maybe some others, but this is sufficient. By making those explicit, we are able to generate the secondary knowledge. In this case, all that knowledge of specific system of number words, whatever, hundreds and thousand and 120 and so on, number line, all these sets of 10 in case of 10-based system, all of that secondary knowledge. That's something that require, of course, a culture specific, that require a lot of conscious processing and so on, the secondary kind of knowledge and all operations. But originally, the source of that knowledge is biologically primary knowledge. Therefore, I mentioned before that we always have something in long-term memory. Whenever in a case of some completely blank sheet and we don't have anything in our mind, even we're facing some new situation, we have something. At least, at the very least, we maybe possibly have some biologically primary or that kind of intuitive knowledge related to the situation. If we make some use of that by making it explicit, thinking about it, and maybe it could help us to deal with the situation. So therefore, secondary and primary knowledge are in a way kind of connected in this sort of development. I almost finished with just a few minutes more, and we finish with that. Because we started a bit late, I was counting on 90 minutes, hour and a half. So that pretty abstract material, there would be no abstract material of such nature in the following lectures. But in the first lecture, I have to do this general kind of that sort of introductory description of all these principles that could make it quite difficult to perceive initially. A lot of information. I understand that, but we will get closer to specific materials and form. So one important thing that is characterizes acquisition biological secondary knowledge when we that we need to be motivated to consciously process it. When we're dealing with biologically primary knowledge, those natural information processing systems, they don't need anything like motivation, because they are naturally motivated to adopt those new patterns. When we're talking about this secondary knowledge in case of human beings, when we consciously process and invoke in memory, this component on being motivated, engaged, is essential, it's important. Without that, we might not be able to do that. So therefore, we're going to talk a little bit for these remaining few minutes about this role of motivation in secondary knowledge and what the implication of this. So in case of human cognition, when we deal with this biologically primary knowledge, we are naturally motivated usually to acquire that knowledge. The children acquire this spoken language, they learn how to understand and listen to it, or how the social interaction, they're not to be motivated explicitly for that, because they're predisposed to learning this quick way. When we're dealing with the secondary knowledge, science, reading, writing, we need to be motivated. Otherwise, we might not be basically talking about school children and students, we won't be able to acquire that. So, in fact, that implicit motivation for primary knowledge and primary activities could, in a way, conflict in some cases with need to engage in that sort of activities that result in secondary knowledge. So, for example, we inherently predisposed as a primary activities to do some social play, like recreating this human social interaction. We do the sports, for example, doesn't require, in many cases, much of motivation, is a ritualized form of social competition, the sports activities, because to a significant degree based on biological primary knowledge. Just pure exploration of the environment that the children do. Again, that's things that they are predisposed to get involved with that. That's something. On the other case, when we try to get them to learn science or to read and write, they might not be able to get involved in those activities without some explicit, intentional motivation and engagement. So they could be playing in the classroom. They could be doing other things, exploring some things, or even doing some whatever planes, some things. But they do that without much need of motivation. They do it with naturally predisposed, so that they are naturally motivated for that. You try to teach them science or mathematics or other things, writing, reading, and you see that they might not be interested or be interested in those other things because they are motivated. So this is distinction between biologically primary and secondary information. It's important not only from point of view of understanding those different type of knowledge, but to see the role of motivation in that. That's something that not much yet talk about in the area. So it's something that I again decided to speculate a little bit And in this case, I call it kind of upward speculation. When before, we talk about downward extrapolation. So going down to the lower level of matter to see if those principles operate. Let's go a bit higher. Would they operate with a sufficient pipe? Would be enough, or maybe we need something else? So important point of human cognition in this case, as is kind of this top level of cognition that we are talking now about and we understand, is that working memory always evolved in this conscious processing of novel information of their secondary nature. And we are inhibiting, in this case, this automatic execution of our primary responses. So in many cases, we inhibit execution of those primary intuition-based reactions by engaging working memory in many novel situations. That's what gives us, as humans, the strength and something that maybe other organisms cannot do. We evolved our working memory, conscious processing, to deal with novel situations effectively that other organisms wouldn't be able to deal when they operate based on those primary just activities. Those instincts, if you like. We are able to inhibit those instincts and engage working memory with conscious processing. That's our strength. So in this case, in case we differentiate this level of human level of natural information processing system from other natural information processing system based on degree of involvement of those intentional, not automatic, not implicit processes, not those primary processes, but more of this secondary type of processes, with conscious processing and working memory. We might call them intelligent natural information processing system, possibly, just to distinguish from others. Doing how that intelligent natural information processing system could be different from others. Do they require some additional principles from those 5? Maybe. There was some suggestions actually in the literature which investigate some complex natural information processing system of that intelligent nature. For example, this study, it's actually suggested something like intention to act as essential characteristic. Essential to act, in this case, as a characteristic of a very complex information processing system. Act on requirement of that sort of additional kind of information patterns in this case. Another study it suggested introducing some principle of preparedness for learning as a guiding principle for information processing systems that involve the change of energy and matter and so on, interpreted in terms of learning. So preparedness for learning, whether it's by borrowing or by random acquisition, intention to act, intention to learn in this case. So that some kind of mentioned characteristic of those complex systems of that nature, intelligent information processing systems. So do we need some additional, let's say, 6 principles for intelligent natural information processing system to distinguish actually human cognition from others? Or we might not call it as an additional principle, but still we need to take it on board and to understand that here we're dealing with a intelligent natural information processing system with that essential characteristic of conscious processing of secondary type of knowledge that also require engagement and motivation. So, but we can introduce possibly some additional principle. We can call it intention to act principle, preparedness for learn principle. In analogy with some of those suggested, I don't know yet. Again, it's just pure speculation at this stage to try to get upward and look from the more general point of view on this natural information processing system and where the human type of cognition is in. intelligent natural information system. So in human cognition, in this case, as I mentioned again, I just repeated myself. We're dealing with intentional characteristic, conscious processing that actually, in this case, require motivation and engagement. So, what the kind of conclusion from that? As you can see, when we're talking about biologically secondary knowledge with a conscious processing, which is require motivation, in this conscious processing in working memory and motivation, they go hand in hand always. Conscious processing, working memory require motivation. In this case, this motivation and a conscious and cognitive processing, they are fundamentally interconnected. So that is things that, again, very important to understand from recently a lot of studies started talking about motivation and cognition and introducing these motivational affective elements into cognitive load theory. Here we have some speculations, still low level speculation, but something that gives us some of that fundamental underpinning for that, because it shows that cognition and motivations are very fundamentally interconnected. No one exists with another when we're talking about intelligent natural information processing systems like human cognition. Okay, so in this case, implications are, and that's the last slide before we conclude. So we may need to pay attention to those specific activities that intends to achieving the goal to motivate learners, which we never look at in cognitive load theory before. So we need to intentionally design accordingly some learning activities to get learner motivated prior to learning the secondary knowledge. But the goal of those activities is not learning knowledge itself, but to prepare for learning, to motivate learners to acquire sort of that knowledge. So that fundamentally means that we might possibly need to pay attention to that as well, which is not always being paid much attention in cognitive load theory. I just making some of those speculation here to create some fundamental sort of some understanding why we need it. That could have some very clear implication later when we talk later in this courses, like for example, when we need a worked example, problem solving, when we need this problem solving for what sort of activities, or what type of goals. All of this abstract material will have clear interpretation and application later in the following lectures. But at this stage, very abstract level, again, I finish with that. So now overview quickly of the following lectures. So next lectures will be about working memory and cognitive load. That essentially in evolutionary perspectives, they're talking about these small limits of change principle essentially. But we're talking about working memories, and we're going to talk about knowledge base and expertise. That would be in human cognition. That would be pretty much talking about this role of information store from terms of evolution perspective, but we're going to talk about very specific empirical sort of results here. Now, next following lecture will be about building knowledge base in long-term memory. That about this kind of accumulation of knowledge, borrowing and reorganizing in terms of evolutionary perspective, but we're going to talk about this building knowledge base, how approaches to this. And finally, we finish this part of the lectures with problem solving in learning and instruction, generally role of problem solving. From evolutionary perspective, that's that principle of random generations and testing, but we're going to talk more generally about role of problem, for which types of goals they are suitable, for what type of goals they are not, and better to use replaced by other means. So we'll be clear instructional perspective here, but we look at that all of this from point of view of those two perspectives that I outlined today. One is kind of empirical and another one is this axiomatic evolutionary. So mostly we're going to talk about this more empirical sort of psychology type of memory structures, but we'll also interpret it from point of view of this evolutionary perspective as well. So we will go through most of those principles and most of those characteristics, and in relations to different different aspects of human cognition. So the second part of this course in the next year, and again, I'm not guaranteed that that can complete final version, but that pretty much would be based on this role of prior knowledge expertise reversal effect. That will be next will be managing instructional guidance based on this, the role of prior knowledge in managing instructional guidance. Then we're going to talk about rapid assessment, that the tools that we're going to use for building some adaptive procedures for managing instructional guidance. Then these adaptive procedures would be another topic of lecture. And finally, we finish everything with some summary of goals and boundaries of instructional theories to round it up everything. So the second part would be, as you see, based mostly on that the adaptive instruction based on rapid assessment and expertise reversal. That's something that this research project and this Leverhulme Trust actually is supposed to do. That's what they're going to do in this case with this project. Hopefully, by that time, we will have not only some theoretical but some empirical result to show and specific materials that we're going to use to demonstrate. So it would be more grounded practically and with specific examples. But this part would be, these following 5 lectures, it would be not tied exactly to some this project specific materials, but I'm going to use a lot of empirical sort of examples from different areas. All right, so that finally, just briefly, the next lecture about working memory and cognitive load. Some characteristic of working memory. I'm actually going to do literally introduction to cognitive load theory, more specific, not like today, some overview, some phases of development, but just some introduction to cognitive theory, some example of some effects. Again, we look at some evolutionary advantages of this information processing and working memory, and that pretty much will cover the next lecture. So that lecture would be next lecture about this working memory characteristic and implications. All right, so thank you very much. I'm sorry I got a lot of time, more time than I expected, but we covered this and we left it behind. So now we're gonna get to more specific materials in the following lectures, using this as a foundation, as some important principles that we're gonna interpret and return back to in the following lectures.
Okay, because we don't have time, so you can save your question for next lecture. Because I think we have another lecture. So if you have any question about today's lecture, you can always send emails to me, and I can, or you can save your question to the next one. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
My goal was to keep those lectures up to 90 minutes maximum, and leave it 30 minutes for question and answers. So, as you see, today's more minus introduction. So, I always say, so 90 minutes maximum, could be even less, depending on specific topic. But I try to keep this topic rounded up, and not to go to them. To transfer something from one lecture to the following lecture, because it will be out of specific topics. So it's better to finish all this, I decided today, rather than this abstract materials, and to talk about this next time, again, out of nothing and not related to directly to specific topic of the next lecture.